Alrighty, dudes, what is up? We are going to be doing today a new video that I wanted to do. Basically, we're going to do a system in review, and today we're going to be talking about Azerite. The reason I wanted to do this is I just wanted to talk about the Azerite as a holistic system, give some reasons that I thought it was good, give some reasons that I thought it was bad, and kind of describe Azerite's progression throughout the whole entire expansion, and maybe what we can learn from Azerite moving into future expansions or future tiers or whatever, right? In addition to that, if you guys want any additional systems in review or commentary on some things that I should be doing in future videos, leave those down in the comment section. I would like to continue doing more videos like this, and if there are some good ideas down in the comments, I would not be opposed to taking them and running with them and give another system in review. Even if it's from something from a couple of expansions ago. I've played at a decent level since about Warlords of Draenor, so I do have a decent amount of knowledge as to how stuff works. Maybe I give a systems in review about Legion Legendaries next, maybe something like that. Maybe I'd give one about essences. We'll see. So TBD, if you guys have any popular opinions down in the comments, make sure to leave those there, and we will be looking for future videos. But now, let's jump right into it. So first off, we got to describe and give a review about what Azerite was. So basically, Azerite replaced the long-term fan favorite of tier set bonuses, and whenever they were first introduced, I thought that they were going to be interesting because they fill out your head, shoulders, and chest slot, and they were pitched as a way to be a little bit more flexible in your choices, where they felt like tier bonuses were far too restrictive on so many slots. Right now, you effectively have 5 slots that are locked down, whereas before you only had 4 because of tier bonuses. So you have your Heart of Azeroth, so your necklace, and then you have 3 Azerite slots, and then your back piece. So 5 slots basically there. But they were pitched as a way to give you a little bit more gear flexibility. I think that's kind of been pushed to the side just a little bit in terms of what the actual purpose is. But Azerite as of itself only locks down 3 slots in a more restrictive manner. So it was pitched as giving you a little bit more flexibility and a more long-term solution to tier set bonuses, more expansion based in that regard, not necessarily just tier to tier based. So let's talk about them whenever we came into the beginning of the expansion and beginning of the patch. So originally there were problems with people getting 45 item level upgrades. Especially once Uldir was released, the first couple of weeks of Mythical Deer, people would get huge upgrades on their Azerite, but would still be wearing 345 pieces of Azerite because they wouldn't be able to equip the higher level Azerite and put the traits in due to Heart of Azeroth Azerite power restrictions that were on the Azerite. I do think that that was kind of problematic, and it kind of burned a lot of people and made them not as on board with Azerite. I honestly think it was just a mismanagement of understanding where people were going to be AP levels wise. I think that was just more of a little bit of a mistake. It wasn't present in future patches. Everybody had access to all of their rings of traits moving forward, but originally there was only one main trait ring, one secondary ring, one tertiary ring, and then the +5 item level, and that was all. So you didn't have the double main trait rings. So there was only one. People were all having problems even getting that one major main trait ring because they were getting huge upgrades from Mythical Deer but not having the neck levels to back that up. So there was issues with that at the very beginning. Then there was also Azerite Reforging. Basically, to be able to reforge your Azerite, it would move you one gold tier down every 3 days. Currently in the state of the game, it is every 1 day, so that eventually got changed. Because people were racking up such insane numbers. I think the highest I saw was 500,000 gold or something like that, something absurd. I paid 123,000 at one point to be able to reforge Azerite because some classes, like Balance Druid, had to reforge fairly frequently, especially if you wanted to play something like another spec or another spec of your class. It was just fairly problematic if you didn't have multiple full sets of Azerite. And the way that the generic traits were originally pitched is generic traits were a good solution if you wanted to be able to swap back and forth between specs, so you could be a little bit more fluid in what you wanted to do. Unfortunately, that did not come into play exactly how it wanted to be. People basically wanted what was the best at all times, so they were willing to reforge to a point where people were spending absurd amounts of gold to be able to reforge to make sure that they did in fact have the best traits. So that was problematic. Eventually got changed. Honestly, the Heart of Azeroth thing didn't happen again. The Azerite reforged cost change got removed fairly quickly. Also, originally, the only Azerite you could really wear that were at a high item level was either stuff that you got out of your weekly cache. So basically, there was no Residuum vendor, which we're about to get to. Got added like shortly after. You could get Azerite out of your weekly cache. So some classes had really good Azerite that they wanted out of the weekly cache. You could get some out of your PvP weekly cache, or you could get some from raid. And the stuff out of your weekly cache was RNG, and that's obviously fairly problematic. The stuff out of your PvP weekly cache also fairly RNG. And then, of course, the stuff from raid was a constant variable. Eventually, they removed the ability for you to be able to get Azerite out of your weekly cache, and then added in a Residuum vendor to where you could purchase specific Azerite or gamble on specific Azerite. It's the exact same Residuum vendor that we know today. Basically, I think this is... I guess we're going to give some... We're going to stop doing the review for here for a second, and I'm going to give some personal thoughts on this. I think that this is like a part of where they went wrong. I think, honestly, instead of like removing it and then adding in a Residuum vendor to allow you to have so many options, I think that you should not have had the option to be able to even get the specific Azerite out of your weekly cache or out of your weekly caches to begin with. I think it should have only have come from like raid, and then like you would be able to grind out some from PvP, but not in a way that you would be able to like trophy it. I think that there ended up being just like too many choices, and this is probably the point in which too many choices like started to begin becoming problematic, is because you just had opportunities to get the weekly cache Azerite from dungeons and from PvP. So there was just like so many fucking choices, like, I don't know, 20 pieces per slot or something stupid. So there were so many different options, which is nice because of the flexibility, but it's also like really annoying. But I don't know. I think that that may have been where like one of the major problems of the system as a whole began. Alrighty. Then so basically the Residuum vendor was added in shortly after Uldir progression ended, like I was talking about. They removed the ability to be able to get Azerite out of your cache. Then, going into 8.1, new traits were added, and some bad traits were removed. I think basically every class got one trait removed, and then they got one trait added. A lot of the one-and-done traits that are staples for classes were currently added in this patch, the 8.1 patch for Azerite. So a lot of very, very strong and very fun traits for most classes were added in at this point. I know Moonkin got Arcanic Pulsar. I think Demon Hunter got Chaotic Transformation, just stuff like that. I think Hunter got Rapid Reload. Beastmaster Hunter got Rapid Reload. So traits like that. Then eventually, a second ring of main traits were added, allowing more flexibility in how you build your character's traits. I think this is actually pretty cool, just because, in theory, you're able to change your character in a way that just like your traits are going to impact your character in a completely different way. I think there's a fundamental issue with how this works, but I think when describing the system, the second ring of traits allows you more flexibility with how your character is built. It allows you more flexibility in terms of what your character is good and bad at. I think this is a nice thing. I think it was poorly implemented because there are problems with Azerite as a system. We're going to talk about that in a second. But I do think fundamentally this was a good move to give a second ring of main traits. All right, so Azerite after 8.1 is kind of coasted. I think that they said that, I don't know if they said this directly, but the gist of it's basically that they've kind of given up on Azerite. They focus on other things such as like essences or corruption and stuff like that. So Azerite's kind of coasted and been on the back burner since 8.1. The only new traits that have been added are specific traits to raid, such as Treacherous Covenant from Battle Dizarlar. There are a couple other Battle Dizarlar ones, but the other ones were like really bad. It was like Bonded Soul and shit. They were really bad. Treacherous Covenant was the only good one from Bod that I remember. Loyal to the End and Undulating Tides and Ashar's Eternal Palace. Those are notable. And then Heart of Darkness from Nightloatha. So those are the only new traits that we've had since 8.1. And honestly, the raid trait's pretty cool. So can't be too upset about that. So let's talk about the good parts of Azerite. And the good part about it, some of the traits were really fun to play. And it was mostly class dependent in terms of like what traits were fun to play. I think for a class like Beast Mastery Hunter, they actually have pretty cool traits. Classes like Havoc Demon Hunter also have some pretty cool traits. Yeah, so some of the traits and make a lot of the specs or a lot of the classes more dynamic in terms of just what they bring to the table, and they do really make them more interesting. But it is a class to class basis. In addition to that, I think some of the good things: Titan Residuum, that plus the second ring of main traits. Whenever that was added, it really gave you a lot of flexibility in terms of how you were going to build your character and what your character was going to be strong at. So for some classes, and I think a large majority of classes, they have to pick between strong AoE or strong single target in terms of their Azerite traits, and the ability to be more flexible in terms of what you're gaining out of AoE or what you're gaining out of single target via your Azerite traits from the Residuum vendor, from the two rings of main traits. Honestly, I like that a lot. Let's also talk about the Uldir raid specific traits, because I thought that those were implemented fairly well and were pretty good. So Laser Matrix and Archive of Titans. With that, you also did, whenever you had a Laser Matrix or an Archive of Titans equipped, you also gained a secondary haste or secondary stats over a 10-week period, which was basically a soft nerf to the content. And all in all, I actually thought that these traits themselves were really, really strong. Just with the re-origination array, I think it gave like a good feel to how the traits should function. So the traits were by far the best once you were inside of raid specific content because of that re-origination array. But then outside of the raid content, they were a little bit more lackluster, and you should be looking to play other things outside of that raid content. And I think that's the mark that they kind of missed. They also had some stuff specific to PvP as well. Whenever you're fighting a member of the opposing faction, there was traits that would do increased damage or give increased benefit, and I honestly thought that those were like really good implementations of how you're supposed to separate out raid specific traits, and then like Mythic Plus specific traits are supposed to be like the more generic style or more class specific stuff, and then in addition to that you have the PvP specific traits. And like I think that was good, and if they like almost doubled down on that and like gave you the two rings, one of the rings being the raid specific, PvP specific, or Mythic Plus specific trait, and then like the other ring being your class specific thing, and give your class flavor one a second ring, I think that those would have been I thought that would have been like struck a pretty good balance in terms of the system. But unfortunately they went the other way, which is more homogenize everything and make everything more accessible to all players, allowing the choices to be less meaningful but also less impactful. So it's a stark balance to strike. It really kind of just depends on where you want to land on top of how impactful the traits should be as a whole. I think that since they replaced tier sets, they should have doubled down and made them more impactful, because they are supposed to be this thing that did replace tier sets. All right, so let's talk about the bad. And I think that the reason that I wanted to start with the good is that I did want to point out that there were some good things that came from Azerite traits, but there was also a lot of bad. So I think let's talk about some of the bad things. First and foremost, I don't care about this one, but I know a lot of people do. Transmog options. I think the biggest deal with the tier set bonuses was the fact that they made just the most lit transmog, and a lot of people care about transmog in this game, and I think the removal of that was a mistake. Anyways, so that I think that was a big deal for a lot of people. No more transmog is like, what the hell? So I think that should be looked at moving forward, regardless of what system we have. Let's talk about the next thing. Generic options for Azerite traits as a whole. So there's stuff like Swirling Sands or Blightborn Infusion and stuff like that are these generic traits that are supposed to be able to allow you to not have to swap if you're playing like multiple specs or multiple classes. But for a lot of classes and a lot of specs, these are the best options. And that's where I have a problem with it, is that there are a lot of sick fucking traits, but a lot of them are just grossly overshadowed by these generic options. And the reason that tier bonuses were so cool is because they impacted your class in a very specific way, and they allowed your class to do like weird things, and occasionally would change your rotation into doing something that's super niche and stuff like that, and they were very impactful because of that. Whereas some of the Azerite traits would impact your rotation and could change your rotation into where you're doing something different. Like for Moonkin, you would use Innervate offensively, which I mean, you could argue that that's bad. Or for other classes, you could it would just like change your rotation into being something completely different and give you a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you're playing your class, and bring back like fun style rotations where you're doing something different. However, unfortunately, they kind of nerfed all of these interesting interactions and interesting options to the point where you were forced to play the more generic traits such as Blightborn Infusion or Swirling Sands, and nothing that impacted or changed your rotation in a meaningful way was ever going to be pushed to the forefront because they were seen as toxic or disruptive to how the class functioned. And I think that that is functionally one of a larger assortment of issues with how the Azerite system as a whole was working. And basically, it just ended up creating not impactful enough class-specific traits, or they would just break your class, and there was really no great line in between the two. Either they weren't good enough, or they were too good, where they would break your class, and then would have to be nerfed or changed. And there was no real in between. And those are really the two major issues that Azerite really had. Of course, there was other problems. Like, I would say that I can give them a pass on all the stuff that occurred pre 8.1 because they did fix a lot of the problems into 8.1. So they really didn't just like let the problems fester, let the problems sit like they did for a lot of other systems in the past. They were pretty quick on the draw of like trying to fix the problems that Azerite had. However, there was just still some things that were never really going to be fixable. And again, okay, so basically my thoughts and my opinions on it are partially like what I said earlier. I think that there were just too many fucking generic options. I think that generic options were a mistake as a whole, and everything should have been like spec specific, and the pieces you wear alternate depending on what spec you're wearing, and you should not have a choice to put on like Moonkin shit as Resto, or you should not have the option to put on Ret Pally shit as Holy or stuff like that. And those traits should have been like forced and like been appropriated to the piece itself, and not necessarily like that. In addition to that, I think that the rage shit and the PvP stuff and like all of that should have been the best for the content that it was doing, but then outside of that content, it should have been a little bit worse. I think that is an important distinction to be looking to make in terms of like how good the traits feel and how good all of the pieces feel, because you're allowed to be overpowered in raid, like, and you're allowed to feel like you're sick in raid as long as there's a balance in terms of how the raid fights work. But then outside of it, those traits are allowed to be worse. And historically, like, PvP tier sets were worn by PvPers and raid tier sets were worn by raiders, and you never really had PvPers wearing raid tier sets, and you never really had raiders wearing PvP tier sets. Obviously, there are definitely some instances where that is not the case. Historically, though, you normally had the PvPers sticking to their PvP tier sets because they gave like huge amounts of damage reduction or interesting utility that is only really impactful in PvP. And then you had raiders wearing their stuff that was like huge damage gains, but like they're not looking for an immense amount of survivability, or they're not looking on for like, oh, Entangling Roots has 300% increased like damage taken before it breaks or something like that. It's just like always random shit like that. And then they also didn't give like resist and whatever else, right? So there's a lot of different stuff like that. There's a lot of problems with Azerite, and I think functionally tier sets make a little bit more sense just in terms of how they were in the state of the game. Also, something that's not really discussed as much is that tier sets, some tiers, your class would get the sick 10 to 15% bonus like damage, where their tier set is very overpowered, and some tiers you get the 4% damage gain, and that kind of kept a pendulum swinging in terms of like class balance, because you never really knew which one you're going to get. Am I going to get the sick one this tier, or am I going to get the less than stellar one this tier? And it kind of kept everything up in the air in terms of like which one you were going to get. So I did think that was actually fairly cool in terms of like being able to just allow classes more fluidity in terms of balancing, because right now we've had all of the same classes kind of be overpowered for a little bit now. Basically, since BOD, most of the same stuff has been overpowered. Actually, since EP, like Eternal Palace and Annihilate, all of the same classes that were on top are still on top. BOD was a little bit different in terms of balancing. So yeah, since EP, it's like really hard, because then you're only relying on external factors to balance the classes, like hotfix buffs, hotfix nerfs, that kind of thing, as opposed to, or corruption, as opposed to stuff like tier sets, where some tiers you get the 15% bonus, some tiers you get the 5% bonus, and a lot of the times the tier sets really change your rotation, and that's what I thought was super fun about tier sets, and the mark that they kind of missed in terms of Azerite and why a lot of people are super down on it. But again, like I said, not everything is good, not everything is bad, and that's why I wanted to do the system in review to talk about it. Again, if you guys like the video, make sure you guys leave a like, subscribe for more content, and again, comment down in the description if you guys want to see another one of these systems in review, or you think that something would be interesting to cover as a whole. I think I may be doing essences next, depending on how well this video does, because I actually enjoyed doing this. I thought this was fairly fun. So we will see you guys later. Check out the channel for the next video. Also, make sure to tune into the MDI this weekend, and I will see you guys later. Peace out.